What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Week 8 wide receiver trade targets. We're doing the same as always. I'll go over wide receiver, buy low and sell high in this one, then running backs tomorrow. We've been doing great so far, so we're going to keep up the exact same logic we do whenever finding buy low wide receivers. Who's getting a bunch of targets, who's getting a bunch of air yards, really high upside routes, but have been unlucky with touchdowns. So, with that being said, let's start off the list with the Rams wide receivers. I mentioned Brandon Cooks last week. He didn't do all that great, just 4 receptions for 59 yards, but I also thought that the Falcons would make the game at least a little bit competitive. They looked absolutely terrible, and this game was over partway through the third quarter, so we just missed a big game from Goff and his receivers. They were looking really, really good, and then they could just run the ball for the last, we'll say, 40% of the game. Robert Woods did show up in the buy low model this week after catching 5 of 7 targets for 80 yards and no touchdowns, which now makes it 7 weeks where Robert Woods has not scored a receiving touchdown. Even in Buffalo, he was averaging 3 to 5 receiving touchdowns a year. So to have none this season is just bad variance. He did score the 1 rushing touchdown 2 weeks ago, but it was also in a 0 catch game against the 49ers. Woods is the only receiver in the top 24 to not have multiple receiving touchdowns, and he's one of just 4 that doesn't have at least 3. He's still 9th in targets, and the Rams are still tied for 7th in scoring. So when you also take into account his upcoming schedule, he's a great buy low. The Rams face the Bengals, Pittsburgh, the Bears, who really aren't that great against wide receivers and just got absolutely destroyed by the Saints. You've got the Ravens, who've been torn apart by wide receivers this season. You've got the Cardinals and Seattle. I mean, it's not that difficult of a schedule over the next 2 months, and there are really no matchups that you're terrified about. We used to be terrified of playing the Ravens and in Chicago, but these defenses aren't the same this season, and he's probably not going to be matched up with Marlon Humphrey when he plays the Ravens, so it's actually a plus matchup. All of this stuff works for Cooks as well, although I'll say at this point, given that it was another week of no receiving touchdowns for Robert Woods, I'd put him slightly above Cooks in who I'm trading for, but also in the trade market, he is going to come at a higher cost. The next wide receiver is DJ Chark, and this is the first time I've mentioned his name in a while this season, but he now has no touchdowns in back-to-back games with under 10 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. But Chark ranks 5th in air yards over the last month, commanding 36% of the Jaguars' air yards over the full season with a really nice 13.5 ADOT. He's the 6th highest rated wide receiver in the season, and look at his upcoming schedule. The next month isn't anything crazy. Plays the Jets, the Texans, the Colts, the Titans. Not really difficult, not really easy, just pretty neutral matchups, although the Jets are a really nice one. But then, look at who he plays to end the season in the most important games for fantasy. The Bucks, Chargers, Raiders, Falcons. The only thing that could make that better is if you say replace the Chargers with the Eagles, but that's basically it. Those are some of the best matchups you can ask for, and Warren Sharp has the Jaguars facing the league's easiest remaining pass defense schedule. He's a guy you should be going after even without considering the schedule, but when you bring that into the equation, it just becomes a no-brainer guy you've got to be looking at to close out the season strong. Another option is basically whatever Jets receiver you want. They got embarrassed on Monday night, but what did you really expect? You know, Sam Darnold is an extremely young quarterback, and he's never faced a defense like that before. So there was no way they were winning that game, and it was very unlikely the Jets were going to look good on offense. But Robbie Anderson had 1 catch on 10 targets and 180 air yards, ranking 2nd on the week. Gilmore is the best cornerback in the league, so the fact that he still had 8 targets is really surprising. Anderson is 7th in air yards over the last 3 weeks and he's being targeted even in brutal matchups. But who else does he have coming up? Well, the Jets play the Jags, Dolphins, Giants, Washington, Oakland, the Bengals, and then the Dolphins again. That is a cupcake schedule. Warren Sharp has it the third easiest among all teams. So right now is the time to buy low on all of their receivers. I talked about Anderson, but even Crowder is a buy low now too. He has 17, 9, and 5 targets in games with Sam Darnold this season, with Monday being by far his worst of those games. So he's going to bounce back, but with less than 9 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 weeks, he's not going to cost you all that much in a trade. Of course, I'm contractually obligated to bring up Mike Williams in these buy low videos. I think I've talked about him in almost all of them, so I'll keep this brief. He's the only player with more than 650 air yards that doesn't have at least 3 receiving touchdowns. In fact, he doesn't have any touchdowns after a historic run of touchdowns last season. Randomness will swing in his favor soon, especially since he's tied for 5th in targets inside the 10-yard line among all players this season. The final buy low wide receiver isn't a wide receiver at all, but I don't make a tight end trade video, so I wanted to include one here. But Travis Kelce is a great buy low right now. He's been insanely unlucky with touchdowns this season, and Kansas City has actually been fairly mediocre in the red zone. He's tied for 2nd in the league with 9 red zone targets and is tied for 3rd with 6 green zone targets. So how's he done? He's caught only 2 of the 9 red zone targets and 1 of 6 green zone targets. He's now gone over 90 receiving yards just once on the season with just 1 touchdown as well. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, I'm aware that Mahomes is injured, but he's only going to miss about a month and a half, maybe even only a month. And then you'll be getting Kelce with Mahomes at quarterback for the final 4 games plus of the fantasy season. And I can promise you right now, this is the cheapest you're going to get Kelce all year, especially since they're going to be chasing points against the Packers this week. And if he ends up scoring, there's no way his owner is going to give him up, because he'll have scored with the backup. They'll think they can still get production from him, and then Mahomes is going to return. Andy Reid is a great coach, and he's going to find a way to get the ball into the hands of his best players. So I'd get Kelce now before it's too late. That's it for buy low. Let's move on to the sell high portion. And I really shouldn't have to tell you this, but right now is the peak value for Marvin Jones. My model has him overperforming by 12.3 points last week. That might be the most of any player all season, but that's going to happen when you catch 4 touchdowns. Even with that performance, Galladay still has more green zone touches than him, still has far more air yards than him. So this was probably the best game Marvin Jones will ever play, not only this season, but in any season. So trade him to an owner that thinks he might actually be the wide receiver 1 in Detroit, because he's not. Aside from Jones, there really aren't any glaring sell highs this week. Everyone that's been overperforming are really more waiver wire guys. So I guess if you happen to have added one of them, then you can try and flip them for someone a little bit more stable in their offense. But guys like Pascal, Erickson, Corey Davis, they've all overperformed recently given their volume. But again, I'd be surprised if you can get anything for them. I would see if you can trade away Larry Fitzgerald. He's had great matchups against Seattle, the Bengals, the Falcons, and the Giants, and yet he's failed to surpass 13 fantasy points over that stretch. Remember, he's been a guy in recent years that's performed really nicely over the beginning half of the season and then has kind of tailed off towards the end. So especially with Kirk returning soon and having 2 games against the 49ers over his next 4 weeks, I just don't see a whole lot of upside for him. So I would try and get rid of him before he has another bad week. I'll also mention Terry McLaurin. I brought him up last week before his 1 for 11 game, and I believe he was the model's number 1 sell high last week. but Washington faces the league's most difficult remaining schedule of pass defenses. So even though he gets to play the Giants in championship weekend, the rest of his schedule is really tough. And Washington only has 11 touchdowns through 7 games with just 12.9 points per game. So the scoring upside for McLaurin, even though he's getting a ton of targets, a ton of air yards, the actual touchdown upside isn't that great. So he's been overperforming in the touchdown department. So if someone's willing to buy him at that value without looking at who he plays coming up and without considering that maybe he's not going to score 50% of the team's touchdowns moving forward, then I'd look to trade him as well. And that really does it for sell high. Like I always want to point out, these are players to sell high on, as their value right now is likely as high as it will be all season. It doesn't mean give them away. It just means that right now is the most you can get for them all year. So if you don't need them and you need an upgrade at, say, tight end or running back, then they're a good player to use in a trade. So those are all the wide receiver and tight end trade targets for week 8. Remember, I can't go over every single name in the buy low, sell high model. So if you want to see the complete list, you can do so at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. I'll go over running back trade targets next, then running back start sits on Friday. So be on the lookout for both of those videos. But that's the end of this one. I hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And if you're new here, how about subscribing to the channel? But thanks for watching.